You use them every day. In your home, in your pocket, on your plate. You'd think they were modern, but they were born in the age of knights, plagues, and castles. From surgical tools and clocks, to eyeglasses and basic banking systems. Medieval minds built the foundation of your daily life. This isn't a story about the Dark Ages. It's a reminder that genius has never belonged to just one era. These are 15 medieval inventions you still use today, and the shocking stories behind them. They called it the Dark Ages, a time often dismissed as centuries of ignorance, superstition, and backward thinking, sandwiched between the brilliance of Rome and the enlightenment of the Renaissance. But that label, first popularized during the 14th and 15th centuries, was never a reflection of reality. It was propaganda crafted by scholars who saw themselves as torchbearers emerging from a long night, eager to paint their predecessors as lost in shadow. In truth, the Middle Ages, spanning roughly from the 5th to the 15th century, were a period of immense transformation. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in 476 AD, Europe didn't descend into chaos. It adapted. Power shifted from emperors to local rulers, from centralized government to feudal networks. Cities shrank, but knowledge didn't vanish, it moved. Monasteries preserved ancient texts. Islamic scholars translated and expanded upon Greek and Roman science. Jewish intellectuals acted as bridges between cultures. In the courts of Al-Andalus, in the universities of Bologna and Paris, and in the hospitals of Baghdad and Cairo, ideas were alive. Mechanical clocks, eyeglasses, printing techniques, water mills, and early surgical tools. These weren't products of the Renaissance. Many of them trace back to the Middle Ages. Entire industries were born during this period, including organized banking in the merchant cities of Florence and Venice. Agricultural methods improved dramatically, thanks to innovations like the heavy plow and the three-field crop rotation system, technologies that supported a population boom across Europe. In the Islamic world, thinkers like Al-Hazan laid the groundwork for optics and scientific experimentation. In Christian Europe, scholars like Thomas Aquinas tried to reconcile faith and reason, opening doors for more structured academic discourse. And across the medieval world, from China to Persia to Scandinavia, craftsmen, engineers, and scholars were reshaping the world not through magic or myth, but through experimentation, observation, and adaptation. The so-called Dark Ages gave us universities, cathedrals, legal systems, public hospitals, and the foundations of modern scientific inquiry. It wasn't an age of darkness. It was an age of transition, often turbulent, sometimes brutal, but far from ignorant. If anything, the label says more about the arrogance of those who came after than it does about those who lived through it. In the 13th century, time was not a personal possession. It was something sensed by the rising sun, by bells calling monks to prayer, or by the rhythm of daily labor. But that began to change in the bell towers of medieval Europe, where something entirely new was emerging. The mechanical clock. The earliest true mechanical clocks began appearing in the late 1200s, with some of the first documented examples in places like Milan, Norwich, and Salisbury. Unlike earlier water clocks or sundials, these new machines didn't rely on natural elements. They used a system of gears powered by descending weights and controlled by a mechanical escapement. A breakthrough in precision engineering. These clocks were massive, often installed in cathedral towers. They didn't have faces or hands. They told time through sound, striking bells at regular intervals. The purpose wasn't to inform individuals of the hour, but to organize communal life. In monastic settings, time meant discipline. The rule of Saint Benedict divided the day into fixed hours of prayer, and precise timekeeping allowed for strict adherence. In towns, bells signaled work shifts, market openings, and curfews. By 1335, Milan had one of the most advanced tower clocks in Europe. In England, the Salisbury Cathedral clock, dating to around 1386, still survives. It was built entirely of iron and had no dial, just a hammer and bell mechanism to strike the hour. These clocks were public, not private. They made time audible, communal, and increasingly regimented. As urban centers grew, time became currency. Markets ran on schedules. Laborers began to think in hourly terms. The merchant class needed consistency for contracts and meetings. This shift wasn't instant, but it was irreversible. The clock was no longer just a religious tool. It was becoming a civic engine. The mechanical minted, likely invented in the 13th century and refined over the next 100 years, laid the groundwork for watches, pendulum clocks, and eventually atomic precision. But it started in the towers, where iron gears turned behind wooden walls, and where time for the first time ticked forward predictably, mechanically, and in public. What had once belonged to nature and the church was slowly becoming part of everyday life. In late 13th century Italy, a quiet transformation began, one that would extend lifespans, not by medicine, but by clarity. By the 1280s, artisans in Venice and Pisa had begun crafting convex lenses, ground from quartz and glass, to correct a problem as old as writing itself: farsightedness. For scribes, monks, and scholars who spent their lives hunched over manuscripts, age brought a slow and debilitating fog. The lines blurred. Letters became shapes. Work once effortless turned to strain. But suddenly, there was a tool that could bring the page back into focus. The earliest surviving written mention of eyeglasses comes from a sermon delivered in 1306 by Giordano da Pisa. He praised the recent invention that allowed the elderly to read again, and even remarked that the technology had been developed within the past 20 years. The innovation likely took root in northern Italy, where glassmaking was already a refined art, and the growing merchant class funded both science and necessity. These early glasses didn't have temples or arms. They were two convex lenses riveted together and perched on the nose or held by hand. There are surviving depictions in paintings and manuscripts. Small round lenses, often balanced delicately on the bridge of a reader's nose. They were expensive, reserved for those who could afford fine craftsmanship: monks copying sacred texts, university scholars, administrators, and legal clerks. But their effect was immediate. Productivity rose, learning continued, intellectual life extended beyond middle age. The technical breakthrough was rooted in an understanding of optics that had traveled from the Islamic world into Europe. Thinkers like Ibn al-Hathum, known in the West as Al-Hasan, had laid the foundation in the 11th century with treatises on vision and refraction. By the time of the medieval lens makers, theory had turned into tool. Over the next 2 centuries, the use of eyeglasses spread. Guilds began regulating their production in Venice and Nuremberg. By the 15th century, eyeglasses were being produced in greater numbers, and spectacles for nearsightedness concave. Lenses appeared by the 1400s. Glasses were no longer a rare item for elite scholars. They were entering homes, markets, and professions. The modern world assumes vision correction is a given. But the ability to read into old age, to study, to write, to work, was once a fragile privilege, and it began with a medieval craftsman grinding curved glass over a simple wooden table. In the medieval world, illness was more than a private struggle. It was a public reality. Disease, injury, and infection were common threats, made worse by limited understanding of biology. But contrary to modern assumptions, medieval societies didn't face these problems blindly. They built institutions, refined tools, and practiced early forms of organized medicine, especially during periods of war. The Islamic world was first to institutionalize the hospital as we recognize it today. In Baghdad, the Bimaristan of Al-Razi, founded in the 9th century, served as a model. These hospitals offered separate wards by illness, running water, trained physicians, and formal medical records. By the 12th century, Damascus and Cairo operated hospitals that functioned day and night, free to all, funded by religious endowments. Patients received both treatment and convalescence, with an emphasis on hygiene, rest, and observation. Medical education was embedded into the hospital system. Surgeons like Al-Zarawi, known in the West as Al-Bukasis, compiled illustrated manuals of over 200 surgical instruments, forceps, scalpels, and catheters, many with direct analogues today. In Europe, religious institutions laid the groundwork. Monasteries across France, England, and Germany maintained infirmaries, but they evolved slowly. By the 12th century, dedicated hospitals were emerging in cities like Lyon and Paris. The Hôtel de Paris, founded around 650 and expanded in the High Middle Ages, housed the sick, poor, and elderly. Though heavily religious in tone, it marked a shift from spiritual care to physical treatment. The real testing ground for medieval medicine was the Crusades. Between the 11th and 13th centuries, armies marching from Europe into the Levant faced wounds, amputations, infections, and disease outbreaks. It was here that the Order of St. John, later known as the Knights Hospitaller, established mobile and fixed hospitals along routes to Jerusalem. These facilities categorized injuries, separated contagious patients, and performed emergency surgeries. The concept of triage, sorting patients based on severity and survivability, took root not as theory but as wartime necessity. Antiseptics weren't modern, but they weren't unknown. Wounds were cleaned with vinegar, wine, or brine. Cauterization was widely used, especially after amputations. Surgical knives and saws were washed, often more for ritual than science, but the effect, in some cases, reduced bacterial load. In the Islamic world, herbal compounds with antibacterial properties, like camphor and myrrh, were commonly applied. Some medieval medical practices were flawed. Bloodletting, humoral theory, and astrology still shaped diagnoses. But within these limitations, a system was forming. By the 14th century, major European cities required physicians to be licensed. Medical texts from Islamic, Jewish, and Christian authors were translated and circulated. The foundation for public health had been laid, not just in books, but in bricks, steel, and battlefield improvisation. Many of those ideas, triage, surgical tools, hospital infrastructure, still guide how care is delivered during crises today. In 1088, a group of law students in the Italian city of Bologna came together, not in classrooms, but in rented spaces, studying Roman legal codes under private teachers. What they formed wasn't yet a university in name, but in function. It marked a turning point. Bologna became the first institution in Europe to organize higher education as a structured, self-governing body, with students hiring professors, setting rules, and forming what was called a universitas. Across the Alps, similar developments were underway. In Paris, by the early 13th century, theological schools linked to the Notre Dame Cathedral evolved into an academic hub. Supported by royal and papal authority, the University of Paris formalized faculties, theology, law, medicine, and the arts, and began issuing degrees that carried weight beyond the city. By 1250, Paris stood at the intellectual heart of Western Christendom, producing figures like Thomas Aquinas, Albertus Magnus, and Peter Abelard. In England, Oxford followed. Teaching had begun there by 1096, and by the early 1200s, it had become a recognized center of learning. When tensions between townspeople and scholars escalated in 1209, a group of Oxford academics fled and established a new institution further east, what would become the University of Cambridge. These early universities weren't casual gatherings of scholars. They operated under formal charters, received privileges from kings and popes, and enforced strict codes of academic conduct. Latin was the language of instruction. Lectures followed set texts, with logic, rhetoric, grammar, and philosophy forming the core curriculum. Degrees took years to earn and marked real status. Adopted titles that still echo in modern academia. Guild structures influenced how universities were governed. Professors belonged to faculties with administrative authority. Students were often grouped by region or nationality, forming nations within the university, each with its own elected leaders and legal protections. Disputes between students and townspeople were common, sometimes violent, leading to royal interventions that reinforced universities as autonomous entities. Beyond Europe, similar scholarly systems already existed. In the Islamic world, institutions like Al-Qarawiyyin in Fez and Al-Azhar in Cairo had been educating scholars since the 10th century. Though structurally different, they shared the same commitment to codified knowledge, debate, and rigorous study. What emerged in medieval Europe was not just a set of schools, but a system. A standardized, hierarchical model of higher education, backed by civil and religious powers, with degrees, faculties, and a professional academic class. A model that would survive plagues, wars, and reformations, and still forms the backbone of global education today. Paper did not originate in Europe. It came from China, where it was first created around the 2nd century BCE during the Han dynasty. The knowledge of papermaking slowly moved westward through the Islamic world, where craftsmen in Baghdad had established mills by the 8th century and eventually crossed into Europe by way of Moorish Spain. But it wasn't until the 12th and 13th centuries that Europe began reshaping how paper was produced, scaled, and used. The key transformation came through water-powered mills. In places like Fabriano, Italy, where the first European paper mill was established around 1276, local artisans adapted existing hydraulic technologies from grain and textile production. Wooden hammers, driven by water wheels, were repurposed to pulp rags, allowing for continuous, large-scale production. Compared to the labor-intensive process of parchment making, which required animal skins, time, and expense, paper was faster, cheaper, and increasingly accessible. This shift had immediate consequences. Paper lowered the barrier to writing. Municipal governments began keeping records more efficiently. Legal contracts, tax rolls, and merchant accounts expanded in volume. Bureaucracy became more detailed. Across the trading hubs of northern Italy, southern France, and the Low Countries, the demand for written documentation surged. In cities like Bruges, Genoa, and Venice, merchants relied on ledgers and correspondence to maintain complex commercial networks. More paper meant more books. And while the printing press would not arrive in Europe until the mid-15th century, scribes and copyists benefited long before universities. Students could now afford personal notes. Monasteries, previously reliant on parchment, began using paper for administrative purposes and non-liturgical texts. By the early 14th century, the production of paper was no longer confined to Italy. Mills had spread into France, Germany, and the Iberian Peninsula. The effect on literacy was indirect but powerful. As writing materials became less expensive, reading was no longer confined to the clergy or nobility. Artisans, traders, and urban professionals gained access to reading and writing as practical skills. This rise in literate laypeople helped shape early humanist thought, long before the Renaissance came into full view. By the time Gutenberg introduced movable type in the 1450s, the infrastructure to support mass communication was already in place. Without water-powered paper mills, the explosion of printing would have been bottlenecked by material cost. The machinery of the written word had been built 1 mill at a time across medieval Europe, and from that machinery came the foundations of the literate, documented, and connected world that followed. In 14th century Europe, carrying large sums of money across borders was a dangerous necessity. Roads were infested with thieves, currencies varied wildly by region, and coins were heavy, inconsistent, and vulnerable to manipulation. Yet merchants traveled constantly from Florence to Bruges, from Genoa to Constantinople, conducting trade at a scale that demanded something safer than sacks of gold. What emerged wasn't just convenience, it was the foundation of modern banking. Italian city-states like Florence, Venice, Siena, and Genoa became the epicenters of financial innovation. These were maritime republics with far-reaching trade networks and powerful merchant families. Households like the Bardi, Peruzzi, and Medici who pioneered a system that would eventually evolve into international banking. At the core of this development was the letter of credit, a document issued by a banker that promised payment at a distant location upon presentation. Instead of carrying cash, a merchant in Barcelona could present a letter in Bruges or London and receive funds in local currency minus a fee. The banker in Bruges would be repaid later by the issuing bank, completing the transaction. This system reduced the risk of robbery and streamlined trade. Across regions with incompatible currencies, these letters of credit required trust, reputation, and bookkeeping. Florentine banks maintained detailed ledgers, tracking every transaction, and credit line, double-entry accounting, a practice introduced in the 13th and 14th centuries and formalized by Luca Pacioli in the 1490s, allowed bankers to balance assets and liabilities with precision. It was a quiet revolution, not in gold, but in record-keeping. Bills of exchange followed a similar model. A merchant in Genoa might sell cloth to a client in Avignon, receive a bill of exchange, and then cash it in Venice weeks later into Venetian ducats at an agreed rate. This process also enabled early currency exchange. Money changers, precursors to modern forex traders operated at fairs, ports, and marketplaces, setting rates and facilitating transactions. The church's ban on usury meant that charging interest had to be disguised through fees and exchange rates. But the reality was clear. Credit and investment had become critical tools of commerce. By the mid-14th century, Florentine banks were financing royal courts, managing PayPal accounts, and backing military campaigns. The collapse of the Bardi and Peruzzi banks in the 1340s, due to massive defaults by the English crown, showed both the reach and the fragility of the system. But even failure didn't halt its expansion. The tools, credit notes, transnational finance, exchange networks, exchange that beyond Italy, what began as a solution to highway robbery became the architecture of modern finance. The global banking system didn't start with skyscrapers. It started with a folded piece of parchment, sealed with wax, promising payment across a continent. By the 12th century, Europe began to harness one of its most abundant natural forces, not with sails at sea, but with towers on land. The windmill, first appearing in documented European use around the 1180s, marked a major leap in mechanical energy production. Though wind-powered machines had existed in Persia as early as the 9th century, the vertical post and tower mills of medieval Europe took the concept in new directions, transforming not only agriculture, but early industry in the Low Countries, particularly modern-day Netherlands and northern France. Windmills became essential to survival. The land there was flat, low-lying, and vulnerable to flooding. Medieval engineers developed wind-powered pumps to move water through canals, dikes, and sluices, creating usable farmland where once there was marsh. These weren't symbolic structures. They were the backbone of medieval land reclamation projects. By the 13th century, the Dutch were building drainage windmills capable of turning entire floodplains into fertile fields. Elsewhere, windmills refined agricultural production. Grain milling, once done by hand or with oxen, could now be automated. A single windmill could grind hundreds of pounds of wheat or barley per day, freeing labor for other tasks. In England, France, and parts of the Holy Roman Empire, local lords often controlled these mills as part of their feudal rights, charging peasants a fee to use them, making the windmill not just a machine, but a point of economic control. But the uses didn't stop at flour. In Germany and Italy, wind-powered sawmills began appearing by the late Middle Ages. These mills used a crankshaft mechanism driven by wind to move saw blades vertically, allowing the mass processing of timber for construction and shipbuilding. The design was simple, but the output was revolutionary. Some windmills even powered bellows and trip hammers in early forges, offering a taste of mechanized metalwork centuries before the Industrial Revolution. These systems weren't widespread, but where they appeared, they pushed the boundaries of what wind energy could do. By the 15th century, the windmill had become a fixture in the northern European landscape, an early symbol of engineered power, harnessed from the environment. It wasn't clean energy in the modern sense, but it was renewable, scalable, and local. In a world before electricity, wind offered something rare, free, consistent motion, no fire, no fuel, no beasts of burden. Long before steam or coal, medieval innovators found ways to turn wind into labor. They didn't invent energy production, but they made it mobile, modular, and useful, one wooden blade at a time. Before the 13th century, clothing in Europe was largely draped, pinned, or loosely tied. Tunics, cloaks, and robes were fastened with brooches or laces, offering little in the way of structure or fit. But by the mid-1200s, a small piece of functional hardware began to change how people dressed and how clothing was designed. The button, paired with the buttonhole, introduced a level of control over fit that had not existed before. Buttons themselves had been used in ancient times. particularly in the Indus Valley as early as 2000 BCE, but primarily as ornamentation. The breakthrough in medieval Europe was not the button, it was the buttonhole. Together, they created a fastening system that was durable, repeatable, and discreet. Historians trace their widespread adoption to northern France and Germany in the early 13th century. From there, the technology spread rapidly across the continent. The impact was immediate and visible. Tailors could now create clothing that followed the contours of the human body. Sleeves became narrower. Bodices could be shaped. Garments could be secured without the need for cumbersome ties or pins. This wasn't just about aesthetics. It was about functionality. Tighter garments allowed for easier movement in labor and combat. For mounted knights, for example, a fitted surcoat reduced drag and improved mobility. Fashion quickly adapted. In the courts of Burgundy and Florence, buttons became both utility and status symbol. A single garment might have dozens, sometimes hundreds of buttons, made from bone, metal, wood, or ivory. The number and quality of buttons could signify wealth and rank. Much like jewelry or fabric choice, buttons also supported layered clothing systems. With more control over fit, people could wear undergarments, tunics, and outer layers in insulation, modesty, and appearance with greater precision. This layered approach became a defining feature of late medieval and Renaissance fashion. By the 14th century, button makers were organizing into guilds, especially in cities like Paris and London, producing standardized pieces for both elite and common use. Though newer fastening methods would emerge in later centuries, the basic button with its simplicity and effectiveness remained. A practical tool became a platform for expression, engineering, and identity. The button didn't just hold clothes. Together, it reshaped how Europeans wore, displayed, and experienced clothing, bringing utility and form into lasting alignment. Medieval Europe is often imagined as a world of filth and disease, but the reality was more complex. While sanitation systems were crude by modern standards, they were far from non-existent. In fact, many medieval castles, monasteries, and urban centers developed surprisingly practical solutions for managing human waste and keeping water sources usable. In castles across England and France, latrines were commonly built into exterior walls, engineered with vertical shafts that led to cesspits or discharged directly into moats below. These garderobes were more than just holes in the wall. Some were outfitted with wooden seats and chutes that angled to carry waste away from the living quarters. In larger stone castles, such as those at Dover or Chateau Galliard, multiple latrines served different floors, with chutes constructed to channel waste away using gravity. Urban sanitation posed a greater challenge. By the 12th and 13th centuries, growing populations in cities like London, Paris, and Lubeck required more than scattered cesspits and chamber pots. Municipal governments responded by introducing basic regulations, fines for dumping waste into the street, mandates for maintaining privies, and designated public latrines. Open sewers, often shallow stone or wood-lined trenches, carried waste through streets and into nearby rivers. In London, the river fleet doubled as both a watercourse and a sewer, which later led to serious pollution concerns. In monasteries, sanitation was often more advanced. Orders like the Cistercians constructed lavatorium stone, wash basins with running water, along with drainage channels and well-maintained privies. Some abbeys even installed simple flushing systems, using diverted streams to remove waste from communal latrines. These practices reflected monastic values of cleanliness, discipline, and order, practical concerns that had theological implications. In Islamic cities such as Cordoba and Baghdad, sanitation systems were often more developed. Homes and public buildings included latrines connected to underground waste channels, and bathhouses maintained regular cleaning rituals. These systems were influenced by Roman infrastructure and preserved through centuries of engineering texts and civic planning, though the understanding of disease was still rooted in humoral theory and superstition. Medieval people recognized the dangers of stagnant waste and contaminated water. Regulations against fouling wells and waterways became more common in the 14th century, especially during outbreaks of disease. Sanitation wasn't universal, and standards varied widely between regions, classes, and institutions. But the popular image of medieval Europe as wholly ignorant of hygiene misses the record. Castles had plumbing, cities had drainage, monks had engineering. The systems may have been simple, but they reflected a genuine attempt to confront one of civilization's oldest problems: where to put the waste, and how to keep life going around it. In the 11th century, an Arab scholar named Ibn al-Haytham, known in Latin as Alhazen, produced a 7-volume treatise that would shape centuries of scientific thought. It was called the Kitab al-Manizia, or Book of Optics, and its influence would extend far beyond the Islamic Golden Age, long before microscopes or telescopes came into view. Alhazen's work laid the groundwork for how humans understand light, vision, and perception. Al-Hasan rejected the dominant theories of his time. The Greek model, championed by thinkers like Ptolemy and Euclid, claimed that vision worked through rays emitted from the eyes. Al-Hasan disagreed. Through experimentation, he argued that light travels in straight lines from an object to the eye, not the other way around. He used a camera obscura to demonstrate how images are projected through a small aperture onto a early analog of the photographic process. His approach wasn't just theoretical, it was methodical and empirical. He introduced the concept of controlled experiments to test optical phenomena. He analyzed reflection, refraction, and magnification, and described how curved glass could bend light. These ideas circulated widely after being translated into Latin in the 12th and 13th centuries, especially in centers of learning like Toledo and Salerno. By the 13th century, scholars in Europe were building on this foundation. Roger Bacon in England studied Al-Hasan's theories and emphasized the value of observation in natural philosophy. Around the same period, artisans in Venice and Pisa were grinding glass into convex lenses. These were the first magnifying glasses, soon adapted into wearable eyeglasses by the late 1200s. The next step was to refine these lenses further. In the late 16th and early 17th centuries, Dutch opticians like Hans Janssen and Zacharias Janssen created compound microscopes using multiple lenses, though often credited solely to Galileo. The microscope was the product of generations of optical development rooted in knowledge, transmitted from medieval Islamic texts. Mirrors followed a similar path. Medieval craftsmen, particularly in Islamic cities like Cairo and Damascus, created polished metal mirrors with remarkable clarity. Al-Hasan had studied their reflective properties in detail. Later, during the Renaissance, European artisans began producing glass mirrors backed with metal, aided by chemical techniques that can be traced to earlier Arabic alchemical practices. The science of optics didn't appear suddenly during the scientific revolution. It was built over centuries through experiments, translations, and applications spanning cultures. What began as a study of vision evolved into technologies that now reveal cells, galaxies, and microscopic life. The path to the microscope didn't start in a lab. It started in a darkened room in 11th century Cairo, where a scholar tested how light passed through a hole in the wall and changed the way humans see the world. Soap is ancient. Evidence of its use goes back to Babylonian tablets from 2800 BCE, where a mixture of water, alkali, and cassia oil was recorded. The Romans, too, used soap-like substances, though often more for laundering than personal hygiene. But it was in the medieval period, specifically in Islamic cities and parts of Europe, that soap took on the recognizable form and function we associate with it today. In the Islamic world, especially during the Abbasid Caliphate, soap-making became both a science and an industry. Cities like Nablus, Kufa, and Basra became known for producing high-quality bar soaps using a mixture of olive oil and lye derived from alkali-rich plant ash. These soaps were hard, long-lasting, and fragrant, often scented with herbs or floral oils like jasmine and lavender. Written records from the 9th century mention not just the use of soap, but its manufacture in specialized workshops. Physicians like Al-Razi, one of the leading medical figures of the time, wrote about soap's benefits in treating skin conditions and its role in cleansing wounds. In Europe, soap making began to evolve during the same period, especially in Spain and Italy, where Muslim influence was strong. Marseille, Savona, and Castile emerged as major centers of production by the 12th and 13th centuries. Castile soap, made from olive oil and soda ash, became a widely exported product. Unlike the softer soaps of earlier eras, these were firm bars, easy to store and transport. These developments coincided with changing attitudes toward personal cleanliness. While earlier medieval Europeans bathed less frequently, the influence of Islamic hygiene practices, combined with growing urbanization, led to more regular use of soap in daily routines. Public bathhouses, common in Islamic cities, began to appear in Christian Europe, especially in Italy, Hungary, and parts of France and Germany. Soap played a central role in these spaces, where it was used for both washing the body and therapeutic treatments. The significance went beyond comfort. During periods of plague and disease, particularly in the 14th century, cities began linking cleanliness with public health. Though germ theory had not yet emerged, the association between filth and illness was strong enough to lead to regulations on waste disposal and the promotion of soap in monasteries, hospitals, and some civic institutions. The soap used todasolid, perfumed mass-produced, traces its lineage directly to these medieval advancements. The techniques developed in workshops from Aleppo to Marseille were not just about luxury. They were responses to practical needs, environmental conditions, and evolving ideas about the body, purity, and health. And centuries before modern hygiene campaigns, people across the medieval world were already using lye oils and ash to scrub their hands clean. In the early medieval centuries, much of northern Europe remained underdeveloped, not because of a lack of people or land, but because of the soil. Unlike the lighter, dry soils of the Mediterranean, the ground in regions like Saxony, Flanders, and the Low Countries was dense, moist, and often clay-heavy. Traditional scratch plows, designed for shallow tilling, were ineffective here. They barely broke the surface. The land resisted. That changed with the introduction of the heavy plow, tool that transformed agriculture and reshaped the European landscape. Developed between the 5th and 7th centuries and increasingly adopted across northern Europe by the 9th century. The heavy plough featured an iron ploughshare that could cut deep into the earth, a mouldboard that turned over the soil, and a coulter that sliced roots and debris. This combination allowed farmers to break and aerate thick soil layers, turning previously marginal or unused land into productive farmland. The design likely evolved in regions where necessity demanded it, perhaps in the Slavic territories or Carolingian frontier zones for spreading westward into Francia, England, and eventually Scandinavia. The Franks, in particular, played a central role in refining and promoting the use of the heavy plough during the Carolingian Renaissance. Charlemagne's empire encouraged agricultural innovation as part of its imperial policy, aiming to sustain military campaigns, monasteries, and growing urban centers. The impact was dramatic. Fields previously unworkable could now yield wheat, barley, oats, and rye. Crop rotation systems, especially the three-field method, became more viable, allowing land to rest and fertility to be maintained. Combined with the use of oxen or, later, horse-drawn harnesses, plough teams became more efficient, and food production rose steadily. Villages expanded, markets formed, population density increased in regions that had once been sparsely populated. By the 11th and 12th centuries, parts of England, Germany, and the Low Countries saw substantial agricultural surpluses. This, in turn, supported larger urban populations and the growth of a non-farming class: merchants, craftsmen, clergy, and bureaucrats. The heavy plough wasn't just a tool. It was a trigger for demographic and economic transformation. By unlocking the potential of Northern Europe's soil, it set in motion a chain of events that would lead to feudal restructuring, monastic wealth, and eventually the rise of medieval towns. Technological change didn't always come from grand inventions. Sometimes it came from iron, wood, and the quiet force of turning earth. In the 13th century, a subtle but powerful breakthrough emerged. From workshops and monasteries across Europe, a device that could control motion, regulate force, and measure time. It was the mechanical escapement, a gear-driven system that changed how machines functioned and how people understood the movement of the world around them. The earliest known mechanical escapements appeared in tower clocks by the late 1200s. These clocks did not yet have faces, but they struck bells at regular intervals. The mechanism behind this regularity was the virgin foliate escapement, a horizontal bar, or foliate, with weights on either end, linked to a crown wheel. As gravity pulled a weight downward, the escapement released gear teeth one at a time, converting continuous force into controlled, incremental motion. This innovation allowed machines to do something they had never done before: keep time accurately over long periods. By the early 14th century, public clocks in cities like Milan, Norwich, and Salisbury were operating with these systems. The shift wasn't just mechanical, it was cultural. Time became predictable, audible, and communal. Urban life began to run on measured intervals rather than natural rhythms. But the implications of the escapement extended beyond clocks. Once the principle of regulated motion was understood, engineers and craftsmen began applying gear systems to other fields. Windmills and watermills, already widespread, adopted more complex gearing to convert horizontal rotation into vertical motion or to power multiple tools at once. Milling grain, pressing olives, fulling cloth processes that once required direct human control could now operate more autonomously and efficiently in mining. Gearing systems powered drainage pumps, lifting mechanisms, and ventilation systems. In textile production, gears ran spinning devices and hammers. Even in military engineering, trebuchets and drawbridges were refined using gear-based motion control. These mechanical systems were made possible by advancements in metallurgy, toolmaking, and mathematical understanding disciplines that were being nurtured in universities, monastic scriptoria, and merchant guilds. Drawings from engineers like Villard de Honnecourt in the 13th century, and later Leonardo da Vinci in the 15th, show complex gear, trains, and mechanical sketches rooted in this early medieval foundation. The escapement mechanism would eventually be in the 15th century. The same principles made possible the first portable clock spring-driven, compact, and capable of being carried by wealthy individuals. These designs directly influenced the development of the mechanical watch and later, the internal mechanisms of engines. The medieval gear and escapement didn't just move machinery. It introduced the idea that motion could be harnessed, regulated, and replicated with precision. That idea became one of the quiet cornerstones of modern engineering. In the ports of medieval Italy, wealth moved not on parchment, but across the open sea. Venice, Genoa, and Pisa thrived on maritime trade routes that linked Europe with North Africa, the Levant, and beyond. But with cargo ships came storms, piracy, and the constant threat of total loss. To navigate this uncertainty, merchants developed something new: a system to distribute risk. Not gambling, not luck. A calculated response to danger, and it would become the basis for modern insurance. By the late 12th and early 13th centuries, Venetian and Genoese traders were using contracts known as bottom. A shipowner could borrow money to fund a voyage, pledging the ship itself as collateral. If the vessel returned safely, the loan was repaid with interest. If the ship was lost, the lender absorbed the loss. This wasn't charity, was a structured investment tied directly to risk. Separate from bottomry were marine insurance contracts. First recorded in Genoa in 1347, these agreements allowed merchants to insure specific shipments: textiles, spices, metals against loss or damage during transit. The merchant paid a premium, and if the ship arrived safely, the insurer kept the payment. If the ship was wrecked or robbed, the insurer reimbursed the declared value. These systems required more than financial instinct. They demanded accurate records, trustworthy brokers, and legal enforcement. Italian city-states developed notaries, maritime laws, and banking families to manage these obligations. Risk was no longer an individual burden, it was quantifiable, negotiable, and transferable. In Florence, the Medici and other banking dynasties adopted similar models for land-based ventures. Underwriting long-distance trade across Europe. Some loans included clauses tied to political or commercial outcomes, foreshadowing modern derivatives. By the 15th century, these methods spread across Europe. Lloyd's of London would later formalize maritime insurance in the 17th century, but its roots trace back to ledgers in Genoa, loan terms in Pisa, and merchant ships sailing under Venetian flags. What emerged from these harbors wasn't just commerce. It was the foundation of risk management. Medieval traders faced an unpredictable world, and instead of surrendering to it, they designed a system to share loss, measure danger, and make the future just a little more secure. The Middle Ages are too often described as a pause in progressa, 1,000-year gap between Rome and the Renaissance. But the record tells a different story. It was not a void, it was a workshop, a period of experimentation, trial, failure, and forward motion. Castles and cathedrals weren't just symbols of faith or power, they were engineering feats. Monasteries preserved texts, but they also drove medical knowledge, education, and agricultural reform. Merchants, craftsmen, scholars, and soldiers alike confronted a world that demanded solutions. They responded with tools, systems, and ideas that still shape modern life. Mechanical clocks divided time. Water and wind-powered mills automated labor. Eyeglasses extended working lives. Paper democratized writing. The heavy plow turned dense soil into fields. And letters of credit moved money farther and faster than any coin ever could. These were not accidents. They were answers to real needs, developed with the materials and knowledge available, then refined through necessity. From Islamic scholars charting optics and anatomy to Italian bankers creating systems of international finance, the medieval world built the scaffolding for what came next. Its legacy isn't just in museums or ruins, it's in every hospital, university, banking app, mirror, book, and bolt. So the question isn't why these medieval innovations still matter. The question is what people, centuries from now, will say about us. Which of our inventions will endure? Which tools will remain useful long after we're gone? History rarely records the moment when a habit becomes a system or when a solution becomes civilization. But it always begins the same way, with people facing problems, building with what they have, and leaving more behind than they ever intended, just as they did 1,000 years ago.